This is BBC News with the latest headlines for viewers in the UK and around the world. Prince Charles leads the UK in remembrance as communities fall silent for 2 minutes to mark the 75th anniversary of the end of the Second World War in Europe. The Queen will address the UK in the next hour. President Trump lays a wreath at the War Memorial in Washington and is joined by several Second World War veterans. In the United States, 20 million jobs are lost as the coronavirus pushes up unemployment to its highest level since the Great Depression of the 1930s. A father and son are charged with murder after the fatal shooting of an unarmed black man in the US state of Georgia. As the UK government decides whether or not to ease some lockdown measures, from Monday, people in Wales will be allowed to exercise outside more than once a day. And 1 week on from the lifting of one of the strictest lockdowns in Europe, we see how the people of Spain are coping with their daily commute.
Today is the first day I leave home and I go to work. I am afraid. You don't know what might happen. You may catch the virus.
Hello and welcome to audiences in the UK and around the world. We're covering all the latest coronavirus developments here in Britain and globally. First of all, Europe has been marking the 75th anniversary of the defeat of Nazi Germany in the Second World War. Events are dramatically scaled down because of the coronavirus pandemic. At a ceremony in Berlin, the German president expressed gratitude for the country's liberation from the Nazis. Here in the UK, a 2-minute silence has been held by and led by Prince Charles and his wife Camilla from Scotland. And the Queen will address the nation in an hour's time. Our royal correspondent Nicholas Witchell reports.
In streets largely deserted due to the lockdown, Britain remembered and gave thanks for the day when the Second World War in Europe came to an end. The nation's tribute was led by the Prince of Wales with the Duchess of Cornwall at the War Memorial on the Balmoral estate. A cannon at Edinburgh Castle marked the start of the 2-minute silence and carefully managed moments of remembrance across the nation. At Balmoral, as the silence ended, the Prince of Wales laid his wreath in tribute to the Second World War generation which overcame the tyranny of Nazi Germany. The cost had been high. Nearly 400,000 members of Britain's armed services lost their lives in the Second World War, and a further 60,000 civilians. Over the White Cliffs near Dover, 2 Spitfires, the wartime fighter aircraft which played such a key role in the defence of Britain, flying today in remembrance of the few, linking the communities over which they flew with the events of 75 years ago, as today's political leaders paid tribute to the wartime generation.
All of us who were born since 1945 are acutely conscious that we owe everything we most value to the generation who won the Second World War.
We remember the millions of people from across the United Kingdom and from across the world who came together in World War II to fight for our shared values. Values of freedom, of democracy, of peace.
On this day in 1945, many tens of thousands of people took to the streets in joyous celebration that the war in Europe was over. At 3 o'clock, they heard a broadcast by Prime Minister Winston Churchill.
Yesterday morning at 2:41 a.m. at General Eisenhower's headquarters, General Jodl, the representative of the German High Command, and of Grand Admiral Dönitz, the designated head of the German state, signed the act of unconditional surrender of all German land, sea, and air forces in Europe, hostilities will end officially at 1 minute after midnight tonight, Tuesday, the 8th of May.
At Buckingham Palace that evening, Churchill appeared on the balcony with the King and Queen and their daughters Elizabeth and Margaret. Later, the two princesses left the palace to join the crowds, as Elizabeth recalled in a broadcast in 1985, reissued today by the palace.
We cheered the King and Queen on the balcony and then walked miles through the streets. I remember lines of unknown people linking arms and walking down Whitehall, all of us just swept along on a tide of happiness and relief.
The contrast between the crowded streets of May 1945 and those same streets today is striking. Yet, 75 years after the end of the Second World War, a nation in lockdown looked beyond its present challenges to give thanks. Thanks which will be expressed tonight in a special broadcast by the Queen. Nicholas Witchell, BBC News.
Leaders across the world have been commemorating VE Day. In the United States, President Trump met veterans at the World War II Memorial in Washington. He was accompanied by First Lady Melania Trump. In France, President Macron laid a wreath and relit the flame at the tomb of the unknown soldier who rests at the Arc de Triomphe. And in Germany, Chancellor Angela Merkel led a ceremony at Germany's Central War Memorial and expressed gratitude for the nation's liberation from the Nazis. A father and son have been arrested and charged in the US state of Georgia for the fatal shooting of an unarmed black man. Gregory McMichael and Travis McMichael were detained on Thursday by the State Bureau of Investigation. Both were charged with murder and aggravated assault. Ahmaud Arbery had been jogging in February when he was confronted by the pair. For more than 2 months, the police did not charge the McMichaels. But in the last few days, a video appearing to show the killing emerged has been widely circulated, and it caused outrage over the failure of the police to take action against the two men. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation said both men had now been taken into custody shortly after their agents became involved.
I can tell you that based on our involvement in this case, considering the fact that we were hit the ground running Wednesday morning, and within 36 hours we had secured warrants for 2 individuals for felony murder, I think that speaks volumes for itself, and that the probable cause was clear to our agents pretty quickly. We realize that emotions have run very high here for a period of time, and still are to a great extent, and we understand that and we respect that.
Well, let's speak to our Washington correspondent, Gary O'Donoghue. Gary, I want to make sure I have the sequence right. No action for a while, then a video is released, and then almost immediate action. Is that right?
That's about the sum of it. The shooting took place on the 23rd of February, and the authorities, the local prosecutors in that area of Brunswick in Georgia, effectively said, look, this was self-defense. These guys were trying to conduct a citizen's arrest, and there's nothing to see here. Then there were some complications that emerged with connections between certainly the elder of the two currently accused and law enforcement. He had worked in law enforcement, some had worked in one another's offices, etc. And finally, earlier this week when the video emerged, not exactly clear when prosecutors first saw that video, but when that emerged, there was a nationwide outcry about it, so much so that Joe Biden, James, called the contents and the evidence on the video, he called it a lynching.
What's been the reaction in Georgia and also the reaction of Ahmaud Arbery's family?
Well, Ahmaud Arbery's family are glad these arrests have been made. There's no question about that. They say he was an innocent man who was out having a jog on a Sunday afternoon and was effectively shot dead for no reason at all by the father and son, who are now in custody. Many people, including the president's daughter, has questioned why it took so long for authorities to take any action. The president described it this morning as incredibly disturbing. There have been questions asked about whether or not there might be any charges in terms of a hate crime. But Georgia is one of just a handful of states in this country that doesn't have hate crime laws. So this will be prosecuted, if it gets to court, as a straightforward murder case. But it's really the evidence of the video that's now been made public that people have found incredibly shocking, almost too shocking to watch, really.
Gary O'Donoghue, thank you so much. Well, staying in America, 20.5 million Americans lost their jobs last month as the coronavirus pandemic paralysed the economy. The US unemployment rate for April soared to nearly 15%. That's the highest since the Great Depression of the 1930s. And the true economic damage may be even worse, as the numbers do not include workers whose hours have been cut or those unable to look for work because of stay-at-home orders. The monthly job figures shown here since the 2008 financial crash show just how quickly the US labour market has collapsed. In the space of just a few weeks, the economy has shed more jobs than were lost in the whole of the last recession. A little earlier, a colleague of mine spoke to our business correspondent, Samira Hussain, about these new unemployment numbers.
We saw that the increase in terms of unemployment over the past month in the Hispanic community has been almost 19%. And that is just huge when you compare it to previous months where the unemployment rate in that group would have been around 6 to 7%. Historically in the United States, we've seen that it was actually usually the black sector that really suffers the biggest brunt of job losses. But if in this last expansion in the labor market, we've seen that actually the minority communities and the black community has actually been gaining a lot of jobs. And this has actually been one of the strongest labor markets for that community. In fact, it's been something that US President Donald Trump has certainly touted quite a bit. So we've seen such a drastic reversal of that very, very quickly.
A little earlier, Heidi Scherholz, former chief economist at the US Labour Department, now the director of policy at the Economic Policy Institute, joined the BBC to give her analysis of today's new figures.
So the unemployment rate, it was reported at jumping up from about 4% to 14.7%. So it was a huge increase, but even that understates how many people are really facing job loss as a result of the pandemic. Because in order to be counted as officially unemployed, you have to be actively seeking work. And there's a lot of people that they're out of work because of the pandemic and they can't look for work because they're not allowed to. Everyone is required to stay at home. And so there's lots of people being pretty misclassified as just dropping out of the labor force instead of unemployed. And then there's another thing where there's a lot of people being misclassified as being employed but not at work. When they're furloughed, we want to be able to see, they should be counted as unemployed so we can really get a sense of how many people are not working right now. If you added all those factors together, the unemployment rate would be 23.6% right now. So we are seeing just astronomical job loss right now. And then to pile on with the grim news, we're still in the middle of this. Like the surveys that we got the results from today were from mid-April, but we saw, another 6 million people apply for unemployment benefits since the survey was taken. So it's going to get worse before it gets better.
The UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson will not be announcing any dramatic changes to Britain's coronavirus lockdown this weekend, instead opting for a cautious approach when he addresses the nation on Sunday evening to ensure that there is no second deadly peak of infections. So far, more than 31,200 people with coronavirus have died in the UK, a figure which increased by 636 in the past 24 hours. As you can see from this chart, showing daily deaths in the UK over the past 4 weeks. The Environment Minister, George Eustice, today set out the UK government's approach.
We have to be realistic that there isn't going to be any dramatic overnight change. We will be very, very cautious as we loosen the restrictions we have. As the data that we're outlining on a daily basis shows, We are not out of the woods. There are still major challenges with this virus. We will be living with this virus for some time to come.
The four nations of the UK each have the power to set their own lockdown rules, and Scottish First Minister Nicola Sturgeon raised the possibility today that Scotland's lockdown could be lifted at a different rate.
I, with the First Ministers of Wales and Northern Ireland, spoke to the Prime Minister. There was, I think, a helpful recognition in that call that the four UK nations may well move at different speeds if our data about the spread of the virus says that that is necessary to suppress it.
The Welsh First Minister, Mark Drakeford, did announce changes to Wales' lockdown today, but only small ones, and guided by evidence showing that the virus is transmitted less easily outdoors.
We will adjust our regulations to allow people to be able to go outside to exercise more than once a day, but we will strengthen our regulations to make it clear that that exercise must be local.
With me is our political correspondent, Ben Wright. For those of us who are not UK constitutional experts, which is 50% of us in this conversation, are each of the nations in the UK, the four nations, simply allowed to do whatever they want in terms of the lockdown?
They are responsible for their own lockdown restrictions and rules, yes. I mean, the general direction is sort of set by the UK government. I mean, that's what Boris Johnson is trying to do. And Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland and Mark Drakeford in Wales have talked about wanting a harmonious UK-wide approach. But of course, for years in the UK, we've had significant devolution of powers to the constituent nations of the United Kingdom. And so in Scotland, you know, they have control over their own education system, their own healthcare system, housing, some financial measures. And even though so far during this lockdown, we've seen almost complete alignment between the nations of the UK, I think you're beginning to see the potential, at least, for that to start to soften a bit as the leaders of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland look at their own transmission rates of this virus and work out what is in our own best interests here. And I think there was a bit of a lot of concern, actually, particularly in Scotland a few days ago when they looked at the British press previewing what looked like a significant relaxing of rules when the Prime Minister makes his announcement on Sunday. That's not going to happen now, by all accounts. I mean, it's clear that I think any changes will be very modest, in line, I imagine, with the sort of things that we heard from Mark Drakeford in Wales today. A bit more exercise, recycling centres opening, libraries possibly reopening, garden centres, things like that. But I think they're going to try as much as possible to keep the four nations aligned.
I suppose because given the fact that there are no internal borders in the UK, if I had an essential journey, I could go from London to Edinburgh or London to Cardiff if there was a need for it. The UK government would want one policy given the fact that anyone can travel anywhere.
I think that's exactly why they see it as a potential recipe for chaos and misunderstanding and confusion if there starts to be significantly different messaging coming out of Edinburgh, Belfast, Cardiff and London, and which is why at a high level ministers talk all the time about how to get that messaging right, because I think it did get a bit muddied over the last few days, and people are sitting here across the UK on a warm bank holiday waiting for guidance, and they're picking up that the rules are changing in Wales. I think the government in London will be very aware that it needs, as far as possible, to keep a coherent single message about the direction of travel. And I think that direction of travel is pretty clear, to be honest. There is going to be no significant move at all in the coming weeks to relax lockdown measures, simply because the disease is still prevalent, the death rate is still high, and there's no sign yet that that danger of a second wave has receded enough for a significant lockdown to be lifted.
Ben Wright, thank you so much. Spain is slowly starting to open after one of the tightest lockdowns in Europe. People can now leave their homes to exercise outdoors, and small businesses have been allowed to serve customers again. But there are still strict rules, including compulsory use of masks on public transport, hygiene procedures in shops, and social distancing. And there are concerns that some are not following the regulations. Our Europe correspondent Damian Grammaticus reports from Madrid.
This is a country cranking into motion again, but cautiously, keeping their distance. Rush hour without the rush, and everyone is masked. It's compulsory now on public transport, even while stations are mostly empty.
Today is the first day I leave home and I go to work. I am afraid. You don't know what might happen. You may catch the virus.
Masks are handed out to anyone who doesn't have them. Marilyn isn't taking any chances.
This is really uncomfortable. You can't breathe easily, but for my protection, I need it.
Most people in Spain are still confined within inside their houses, so this limited opening brings risks. Among them, as people come out, they'll start to behave in a way that enables the virus to begin to spread again. A street party on the first day the lockdown was lifted was exactly what the authorities feared. Those who took part are being fined €1,000 each. So police move people on. And as businesses open, distancing is enforced rigorously with safety tape and screens. Or visors and limits, one customer in the shop at a time. The first visit to the hairdresser means a friendly greeting, but feet must be disinfected. Hands cleaned, and more gloves and masks. All by government order. This is a high-risk place.
Risk? Yes, there is. Until we have a vaccine, everybody is at risk. I hope for the best.
Then the place is swabbed down before a new customer is allowed in. But getting people to maintain a safe separation is a problem. As the rules relax, the numbers outside are growing, and not everyone keeps their distance.
What I don't like is that not all the people is very aware of what the situation is, and I think they don't really respect the rules, the basic rules that we should have.
I mean, there's a lot of people, but yeah, I think we try to keep it clean,
as safe as possible.
Yeah, as safe as possible, yes.
So underneath the surface, there's real nervousness, even as Spain starts to relax and embrace its newfound freedoms. Damien Grammaticus, BBC News, Madrid.
I just want to bring you right up to date with news from Downing Street. Downing Street has released a statement saying that the Prime Minister has spoken to the President of the European Commission. In that statement, Downing Street says both leaders welcomed the good cooperation between the UK and the EU on the coronavirus, including the global effort to repatriate citizens. The Prime Minister, the statement says, congratulated the European Commission on the €7.4 billion raised at Monday's pledging conference, and President von der Leyen thanked the UK for that's the British £388 million pledge for vaccines, treatments and diagnostics. The Prime Minister gave an update on the UK's domestic response. The two leaders, agreed on the need for ongoing cooperation in the fight against coronavirus. Well, let's take a look at some of the other stories making the news. Italy has become the third nation in the world to record more than 30,000 deaths from the coronavirus. The other two are the UK and the US. Italy's latest daily death toll is 243. A disagreement over the appointment of a chairperson to lead a key committee led to fights breaking out on the floor of the Hong Kong legislature. The scuffle is the latest sign of rising tensions between pro-Beijing and pro-democracy camps in the semi-autonomous Chinese territory, which is scheduled to hold elections in September. The government of Kuwait has announced that the country will go into total lockdown from Sunday until May the 30th. The small Gulf country has reported more than 640 new cases of the coronavirus in the past 24 hours. The Interior Ministry is expected to seek the army's help to enforce the lockdown. Let's end the programme by returning to our main story, the 75th anniversary of VE Day, the defeat of Nazis in World War II. Let me leave you with some of the highlights from the day's celebrations here in the UK.
Advance Britannia, long live the cause of freedom. God save the King.